Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining Docusign, the California Land Title Association and National Notary Association for today's Advancing Remote Online Notary in California webinar. My name is Cinnamon Rogers, and I am Head of Global Government Affairs at Docusign. Today's event will provide you with insights from the leader of RON legislation in California State Assembly, illustrate how remote notarization works through a demonstration of the technology, and finally, we'll hear from a panel of experts on the benefits of RON for California consumers, state and local agencies, businesses, and notaries. I now have the great pleasure of introducing California State Assembly member Reginald Jones-Sawyer Sr., who represents the 59th District, which includes Los Angeles County. Assembly member Jones-Sawyer has been a tireless advocate for marginalized communities throughout his career, fighting for social and economic justice for all Californians. In the state legislature, Assemblymember Jones-Sawyer has brought forward legislation that prioritizes working family, invests in local schools, and funds programs to reduce recidivism in underserved communities. Most notably for today's webinar, we are pleased to have Assemblymember Jones-Sawyer here as the author of AB 1093, the Remote Online Notarization Bill introduced in the California Assembly. This important legislation would allow a notary public registered in California to offer remote online notarization services to their customers, as most other states already allow. This would create access for consumers of all socioeconomic backgrounds to leverage these important services from any location online. COVID has certainly highlighted the importance of doing important transactions like this safely online, and we look forward to working with Assemblymember Jones-Sawyer to make this a reality for California. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. First, I really want to thank Docusign for inviting me to join you today to speak about online notarization. As many of you know, earlier this year, I introduced AB 1093, the California Notary Protection Act, as an opportunity really for California to envision what remote notarization will look like in our state. My focus with this effort is to ensure access to and preserve the integrity of our notary system for California consumers. For those of us who aren't aware, California notaries are a vital component of everyday life and perform invaluable services for the business, nonprofit, legal, and real estate communities. These industries cannot function without notaries. However, during the pandemic, mobile notary service performed an often unseen essential service, ensuring that our businesses and nonprofits were able to continue serving consumers throughout the state. The COVID-19 panic has highlighted the need for more flexible options for accessing notary services. And on a personal note, some of you know, but me, my mother's 84. She's in the hospital. She's had several health challenges. The most recent one was last week, and she decided she wanted to have a power of attorney. I went and got the paperwork from the nursing office, and she said I needed to have a notary. My mother couldn't leave, so that we had to bring a notary in. But they had this rule during COVID that only one person at a time could come visit my mother. I'm not going to name the hospital because once I explained the absurdity of what they said to me. And then they said, and you have to have a witness. So I said, how does a notary come in one day and a witness come in another day, but you're not going to allow them to come in the same day? They went back to the nursing station. They went back to the administration. And that became an exception that you could have the notary and the witness in the same room as the patient. And as you know, you need both of them together at the same time. The other thing is on my mother's power of attorney, so it couldn't be me that signed off. Ultimately, we never got it done because of how ridiculous what's happening with COVID is that you can only have one person a day come in and visit that patient. So COVID has also showed why we need those mobile services, especially to seniors and shut-ins and invalids, but also how the hospitals and other medical facilities need to understand they need to adapt to the new changing rules. So AB 1093 will help California join at least 33 other states that have adopted baseline requirements for utilization of remote online notarization. My goal next year is to ensure California has access to secure, reliable, remote online notarization technology that supports industry and consumers alike. Again, thank you for having me, and I look forward to working with you to ensure that we implement the very best remote notary framework for our state. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member. We really appreciate your thoughts on this very important topic and appreciate your leadership in moving legislation in California, and especially appreciate your personal anecdote that shows the reason that moving legislation on remote online notarization is so important in California. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Now we will transition to a demo. Our goal is to demystify what a remote online notarization looks like. So we pulled together a demo of how Docusign Notary provides notaries and consumers the ability to complete the notarial act virtually in a safe, secure online environment. To provide our demo today, we have Andy Ambrose, who will now walk us through a remote online notary session.
Thank you so much, Cinnamon. And on behalf of the Docusign Notary team, thank you so much to all the attendees today. We're super excited about being part of the new notary, remote online notary technology, and especially excited to be part of helping California advance your legislation. So thank you again, Assembly Member, for that very powerful anecdote. It just rings true, and there's so many testimonials we hear every day similar to that, where truly marks a need for this solution. I'm Andy Ambrose. I'm part of I'm a practice lead director with the Docusign Notary team. We've been diligently building an enterprise grade solution for over 3 years. It's important to note, and just from the polling questions, I see how important to everyone security is. And that I just wanted to make a note here that we've built our solution purpose-built to meet the stringent and most rigorous information security standards of the largest organizations in the world. So that's a very important component. And hopefully today, during our quick demo and our preview, we can shed some light as to how we do that. So I'm going to talk through this demo, and just to set the tone, we've created a demonstration around a state, the Washington state to be used in this example. Washington's a state that has passed legislation, and one that we've gone through the very strict and rigorous application and acceptance criteria. The users in this demo will be a program manager, Sarah, who is the one creating and sending a document, an envelope as we call it, to be created and signed by a client, Kathy, and then a notary who's going to join. And what you're seeing here is the Docusign Console that allows for a notary, a sender, to create notarial documents to go out for signature. A sender will create a notary group whereby they'll be assigning a notary and one or more signers to sign a document. And I'll pause here. What you're seeing is Docusign's technology. Docusign Notary has been built around a 20-year trusted brand of the most secure way to get documents signed electronically. And so this functionality has always existed to be able to take documents, convert them to digital versions, and tag and prep those documents so that you can create a very structured way that a document can be sent out and completed. What you're seeing in this screen is the example of a template being created. And so there's some great functionality for an organization. Let's say there's a form that's a release form or various types of affidavits, power of attorneys that are repeatable forms that you could use a standard template. Docusign technology allows for you to create those templates so that you can use them in a repeated fashion and skip some of the steps it takes to prepare a document each time. But we also provide the flexibility for a one-off document, as we call it, to be created each time if there's a uniqueness to that document. It's also important to note that if someone's preparing a notarial session or is a notary in a particular DocuSign instance, we have strict security measures to only allow those personnel. There can be multi-factor authentication required to be able to create envelopes and to be a notary that's part of a certain group. So as you see here, there's additional fields that we've created particular to notary, a notary seal. So there's a digital seal and stamp. We, of course, adhere to each state by state's very specific requirements of those stamps and seals. And so when you're ready to send an envelope out for signers and notaries to join, what you're seeing here first is a system check that's required. And I'll back up here and just pause for a second. That system check is essentially designed, again, to meet the state-by-state requirements that video and audio is required to be recorded and then allowed to be stored and downloaded for audit trail reasons. So a system check is necessary to ensure that a signer and a notary are joining this session on a device that has a camera, a microphone, and a secure internet connection. So once that system check has taken place, next, we go through a multi-factor credential analysis. And again, this security is in mind here to ensure that the signer is who they are. So a signer will be required to enter some basic information. And once that's entered, a signer will be prompted to select which government issued ID that will be used, where an image will be captured using the camera on the device attending, front and back. We're securely taking a snapshot of this image and comparing the information about that governmental issue ID against the information to validate it's a valid ID. Next, the second part of that is a second factor of credentialing that essentially asks questions only the signer should know based on their credit history. And so you've got one element that's the credentialing of the ID itself and validating through that. And the second one is knowledge-based questions that allow for you to do a second way to authenticate. Again, important to note, we see legislation across the various states, in some cases offering flexibility to even add a third possible credential analysis using biometrics. So we see a lot of creativity and flexibility, but important, again, to note that all the states do have a multi-factor credential analysis where you're picking at least two ways to make sure the person is who they are. So once you've validated and been credentialed, you're ready to join the conference. It's a seamless solution built to be one single platform without requirement for downloads or any type of plugins. The recording always gets permissioned so that this can again satisfy the state-by-state requirements. And in this case, you see the sample Washington quitclaim deed. Now you're in the context of a secure audio video session, but you also will have the ability to complete the form together with the signer. And this ability to synchronously edit and collaborate on a document is an additional benefit to allow to make sure that forms get completed to accuracy. And finally, when you're ready to perform the notarial signing, the notary will advance that, will complete an electronic journal. Instead of jotting that down in a notary journal book, you have this added security again, that this journal is created electronically, becomes part of this audit trail that can be stored electronically. So once the journal is completed, you'll see some familiar Docusign e-signature technology where you're completing documents by following the simple prompts to start, sign, and finish. And in the case of a notary is doing that in the same fashion by just finishing it by applying their seal. Recording is ended. You've completed a notarial transaction, not having to be physically in the same room. And Docusign as a platform, meeting the requirements, again, state by state, creates a version of the audio video recording and the journal that can be downloaded by the notary and really stored. Is the obligation of the notary to store those records for a period of, we see between 5 and 10 years. So that can be done locally based on information security protocol of the organization, but also DocuSign has created a way to be the storage, long-term storage solution. And finally, here you're just seeing the notarial journal that is an electronic journal that has all the information that a notary takes down to perform their act. And that's just a quick preview. And I really appreciate, again, the time. Cinnamon, I'll turn it back over to you. And thanks again.
Thanks so much, Andy. And now we're going to move to our panel to discuss how the availability of RON could benefit Californians. I will make quick introductions and then hand over to our moderator, Doug Luftman. So first, we are pleased that Craig Page, the Executive Vice President and Counsel of the California Land Title Association, is able to speak on our panel today. Craig is well-known and effective thought leader on the topic of RON and recently spoke on behalf of supporters of moving legislation in California before the Secretary of State's RON informational hearing earlier this year. CLTA is, of course, involved in property transactions across California and employs thousands of notaries to support their customers. Second, pleased to welcome Bill Anderson, who is the Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Notary Association, where he oversees legislative affairs, notary bond, and insurance programs. Bill elevates the notary public office and is a nationwide authority on notary best practices and ethics. And our moderator today is Doug Luftman, Vice President and Deputy General Counsel, Product, Innovation Services, and Government Affairs at Docusign, who is leading efforts to educate California policymakers and industry influencers to understand the benefits of Docusign's notary product. With that, I will turn it over to you, Doug.
Thanks, Cinnamon, and good morning, everyone. So really excited to transition into this next part of the discussion, and having such prestigious people on the panel is enormously exciting. So the thinking is for probably about the next 15 minutes or so, really kind of dig into a couple of questions and kind of posing it to both Bill and Craig. Maybe the first one I will pose is what impact will enacting RON legislation have on each of your areas of expertise? For example, the notary experts in the land title and mortgage industry, as well as even in just kind of government affairs and lobbying efforts. So Bill or Craig, would one of you like to kind of start off?
Well, Doug, I'll start. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this event, and congratulations on your DocuSign notary product. Remote notarization has already made us rethink the steps we've followed, for decades in performing a notarial act, how someone appears before a notary, how the individual is identified, even the value of notarial records. It's made us look afresh at how documents are recognized across state lines. And it's made me and my role begin to think about how we apply new standards of practice and professional standards for notaries in remote notarization.
Great, thanks, Bill. Appreciate that notary perspective. Craig, what about from the Land Title Association standpoint? Your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that with CLTA, we've gone from a position within the title industry of cautiously liking the technology to now strongly supporting it, because I think we were looking at a whole bunch of issues the legislature was addressing in terms of privacy and things that we'll get into later on. But I think the industry is looking to shorten escrow times, and hoping that some of these automated features, not automated features, but some of the new technologies will help us to shorten escrow, create new technology and convenience for consumers. The title industry is throughout all 58 counties of California. We have thousands of notaries that are belong to NNA and obviously are regulated by the Secretary of State. So we look forward to making sure that they can participate in the notarization as well. I mean, the legislation, as I know we'll get into later on, we haven't got it in place yet, so there are some frustrations about moving Ron forward, and we'd like to do that as quickly as possible.
Great, that's really great insight. Thank you, Craig. So maybe a follow-on to that, maybe Bill, for you is, how does Ron help first-time home buyers, rural communities, communities of color, or immigrants with regard to kind of this technology? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, to the extent that first-time home buyers are from a younger demographic, like my two 30-something daughters, remote notarization presents them with a transaction process that they're already comfortable using. They really won't want to have to sign stacks of paper for purchasing or refinancing their homes. For Californians who live in rural communities or in outlying areas where proximity to an available notary may be limited, they will have more immediate access to a notary than they have now. And in terms of the immigrant community, immigrants may be able to access a notary who is fluent in their own language more easily than they are now, because the notary can be in any part of the state when they perform a remote notarization.
Great, thank you, Bill. Appreciate that. Craig, any additional comments on this one?
No, I think that the convenience will, as we grow into this technology, I think it'll be, consumers will, at first I think it'll be a little bit slower on the uptake and people going through it, just like having to deal with Zoom and learning that. But I think over time we'll see some cost savings, we'll see some time savings, and I think that while the title industry focuses almost predominantly or exclusively on real estate and the market, there are a lot of legal documents, as the author and others have mentioned, that need to be notarized. So there's a huge world of notarized documents that could be positively affected by Ron.
That's great. Now, maybe shifting a little gear to something I think Andy mentioned before. I mean, obviously our product is based on our 20-year kind of solid electronic signature technology. I would be curious to hear, perhaps Craig, your take on, how does this technology support, a safe and reliable Ron experience from your perspective from a land title? Because obviously from a title standpoint, it's enormously important to have, an end-to-end solid technology platform to rely upon.
Sure, I think that, the title industry, I think, is often, people forget, we have a huge amount of liability associated with escrow and real estate transactions and the policies that we issue. So I think the more secure that the platforms are in making sure that the notarial process is not fraudulent and is accurate is really important to the industry. There are a number of losses that we suffer every year from notarial fraud related things. So I think that anything that locks down and guarantees that we have, in fact, the right signatories sitting in front of the notary signing the documents will help target the fraud on that side of the equation.
That's great. Now, Bill, what about from the, thanks, Craig, really appreciate that. And now, Bill, what about from the notary standpoint? How do you view this technology kind of further helping the notary publics?
Well, so, the technology creates a safe remote notarization environment by using multiple factors to identify the signing parties, and not just one, like we use currently in the paper world. The safety of the process is also enhanced by encryption technology, which renders the documents tamper evident, is the term we use, after the documents are signed. And this is important. So the parties can know who has touched that document all throughout the process. And if somebody touched it after the document was notarized, they can then know when that was, who did it, and whether they can trust it. From a reliability standpoint, in the real estate industry and Craig's industry, one thing this technology does to make the process more reliable is it helps eliminate the errors that notaries can make in notarizing refinance documents. Sometimes they'll inadvertently forget to put a date or the name of the party in the notarial certificate, or maybe they'll forget to affix their seal. Well, the platforms and the workflow is set up so that it won't let you finish the process if you've missed something. And so errors will be dramatically reduced, which will result in a shorter time to close.
That's great. Thanks, Bill. So I think something you kind of alluded to there is that with regard to electronic notarization, obviously in-person electronic notarization has been around for a number of years already, which would be sharing a laptop back and forth. I'd be curious to hear, what do you see as the benefits of RON versus traditional in-person notarization, whether it is the electronic, I guess we would call it iPen notarization, or even just the more traditional of physical notarization, and how that offers benefits to consumers and notaries.
Well, so, for a consumer, we've mentioned that, they can have a document notarized at any time, anywhere, without having to search for or to travel to a notary. It could be the only way for consumers residing or visiting a foreign country to have a document notarized, or as Assemblymember Jones-Sawyer indicated, so powerfully in his anecdote, if you're sick or in the hospital, it provides a real benefit that a paper-based process can't afford. Now, for notaries, it cuts the cost of time and travel for those notaries who provide services directly to the public. And it eliminates, again, for those notaries who do refinance and mortgage loan signings, it eliminates them having to print out the signing set and the borrower's copies of the documents, hundreds of pages of documents. And also, the platforms automatically create journal entries and the recording of the remote notarization. So that is a time saving as well. And then finally, for those notaries who travel to meet people that they don't know today in the paper world, sometimes they have to go places where they've never been before. They certainly have to meet people that they've never met before. It's certainly a lot safer to do that online with a remote notarization.
Great, thanks, Bill. So Craig, let me pose maybe a slightly similar question. How does RON enable the land title industry's ability to serve customers?
Well, I think obviously the convenience factor is enhanced to Bill's point, and something we've had throughout this whole COVID crisis is the necessity to meet in person with the consumer, because we were not given the executive the authority to do the remote online notarization. We asked for an executive order and it was not granted. So title companies and their folks who are going out and closing deals in person, even though we're seeing variants and different uptick in the COVID crisis again. So I think anything we can do to give consumers the ability to sign documents and notarize documents without them having to physically visit an office would be a very positive thing. And again, I think there'll be some time savings as well for escrow closings once we get familiar with the technology.
Great, thanks, Greg. Appreciate it. So, Bill, why don't I pose this one to you? What type of data does a notary collect and retain, and how is that different for RON?
So, in the paper world now, a notary in California is required to collect and retain in a Journal of Notarial Acts the information from a state-approved ID card, including the type of ID, the serial number or identification number of that ID, and the issuance or expiration date. Now, in other contexts, this information would be considered personally identifiable information. Now, in most state enactments of remote notarization today, a notary doesn't collect this information. In a remote notarization, a picture of the signer's ID, like we saw during the demo, is taken, and it's processed through a third-party credential analysis solution to determine whether that ID is genuine. The picture of the ID and the information from that ID that is used to perform this credential analysis is usually not retained in the remote notarization platform, nor recorded on the audio-visual recording of the remote notarization. And in most states that have enacted remote notarization, the notary can contract with a custodian or a repository to store audiovisual recordings. They won't have to necessarily store gigabytes of data. And these custodians or repositories would then be responsible for complying with the CCPA data privacy rules.
Great, thanks, Bill. So on maybe that similar topic, Craig, I thought it was interesting that Bill was talking about that basically you can control the recording itself, and therefore you can cover, PII or personally identified information by not having it recorded and actually having it through, other very, should we say, tight systems. But this all seems to come back to kind of this question of privacy, and I know that's one of the big topics. So I would just be curious from your perspective, is RON covered under other state consumer privacy laws, or is there a need for privacy provisions to actually be in kind of a RON legislation itself? So I'd just be curious to hear from your perspective, Craig, your thoughts on that.
Well, I think clearly the CCPA and the CPRA, I always get the acronyms wrong on the latest initiative. I think both of them clearly apply to RON, the RON technology, and the data that would be gathered there. And I think there are abilities through these platforms and systems to minimize the data that's gathered, so only what's crucial will be part of the recording and be part of the process. So I think that it's imperative that we work on that, and I think that the privacy issue is more of a political one, I think, in California, in that the so-called privacy groups or groups that would be considered themselves consumer advocates are concerned about where does this data go, what happens to it. So I think to the extent that we do something in the legislation that maybe is redundant and reiterates that the CCPA does apply and the CPRA does apply, may be necessary just so it gives legislators and consumer groups, I think, comfort that the privacy regulations will protect consumers.
That's really helpful. And what that seems to be is also looking at other legislation around the country, that it seems as though that other states have not been concerned about this, and that the current protections that are out there actually already address it. So I like your suggestion of potentially, if something is needed just to provide additional comfort, is just to reiterate it. So on that note, Bill, I know you've been tracking a lot of the RON legislation around the country. I'd just be curious to hear your take as to the status of that legislation.
Yes, it's been very busy this year and for the last few years. To date, 39 states have enacted permanent remote notarization legislation. By permanent, I am not referring to the temporary COVID-related authorizations that were pushed out last year and this year in governor executive orders and emergency legislation. As far as the remainder of the year in New York, there is a permanent remote notarization bill on the governor's desk awaiting her approval. And there's still the possibility in a couple of states who are having special sessions throughout the rest of the year to maybe pick up another state or two this year. So in 2021, we've seen 10 states enact permanent remote notarization, and it's operational in all of these states, except for the states that have enacted legislation this year, and also in Louisiana and Vermont. But by February 2022, all of these states, except for Vermont, will be fully operational with remote notarization.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I appreciate that update as to kind of what the state of affairs is around the country. So Craig, maybe as a follow-on to that, especially in light of Ron actually not being in the state of California at this time. You know, how does Ron enable the land title industry generally, where you don't have all the states actually having legislation in place already, but obviously needing to continue to operate? So I'd be curious, just how does Ron enable your industry to serve those customers?
Well, we would really like it in California, obviously, because we've got a bit of a conundrum here, because of the interstate recognition concept and Commerce Clause in the U.S. Constitution, and long-standing all the notarizations throughout the country, at least in the paper-based world, have always been accepted for recordation in other states. And I think that in California, the concern that we have is we're starting to see, because Ron has not been adopted in California, we're in the position where Ron notarized documents executed out of state are starting to trickle into California and being recorded. And they're being recorded, and I think at all the larger electronic recording counties, I believe, are accepting them for recordation. So I think one of the things I've tried to stress to the Secretary of State and to legislators is, it's not really the Secretary of State that controls what can or cannot be recorded in California. It's up to the county recorders. And they've made a determination that Ron notarized documents from out of state, executed and notarized out of state, are acceptable for recordation. We'd like to see that California notaries to be so empowered so that they can actually do it within California, both within title companies and independent notaries, so that we can bring that notarization process into the state.
That's really great insight, Craig, especially showing that really kind of the concept of remote online notary is not state by state specific, but rather it's really a national movement. And really the question seems to be is, can we enable notaries in California to actually be part of that process? It's already occurring in the state today. So maybe as a follow-up to that, Bill, from your perspective, what is your sense of why there's a push for use of remote online notary happening now, of course, specifically in California and more generally?
Well, I suppose more generally, there's a lot of reasons why there's been a push. In the early enactments, I think certainly those might be attributed partially to the gig economy disruption factor, the Uberization of the notarization industry. Even before COVID happened, there were 22 states that had already enacted remote notarization. But certainly in 2020 and 2021, COVID has played a big role in the 17 states that have enacted it during this time. Also, I think it bears pointing out that the American Land Title Association and the Mortgage Bankers Association have lobbied to enact remote notarization across the country, as well as in the US Congress. And I think more generally, I believe there's been a push for remote notarization because people think it's more secure as well as convenient.
Great, thanks, Bill. So, Craig, I'm thinking maybe going back to kind of some of the comments you've made about your industry. Have any national organizations incorporated Ron platforms and the technology to date? And can you maybe just elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think that if you look at, like, one of the things that's given the title industry comfort has been MISMO, the Mortgage Industry Standards Maintenance Organization, recognizing Ron technology. I mean, they have for a while, but they've been improving the standards, the document standards there, and I think that's given the industry some comfort that you'll see nationally a higher standard on the remote online notarization process. One of the concerns that CLTA and the industry had initially was that some of the standards in some of the states were fairly low on the Ron process. And so, unfortunately, since we don't have a federal oversight or regulatory process that would have allowed us to enact Ron on a national level, it's kind of been a piecemeal approach from state to state. But we've seen states improve their technology and actually the regulatory oversight, like in Virginia and others. So I think we're starting to see more confidence in in the process per se, and the state's improving it. Also, one of the concerns that we have is if you look at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the secondary market, during the COVID crisis, they put out a list that's still probably out there of what states have remote online notarization are recognized through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which states aren't. California, unfortunately, is not one of those, unless that designation has changed. So what they were signaling at that point is that even though you could have a remote online notarized document from out of state, it's kind of frowned on by them, and they would rather see RON incorporated into California's statute, and we support that as well.
Great. Thanks, Craig. Appreciate that. So let's see. So I realize we're kind of starting to kind of hit the end of the hour here. So maybe a couple more questions. Bill, maybe one for you is, how are notaries protected from liability concerns? I mean, is there a difference in liability between a traditional notarization event and a RON service?
Yeah, thanks. California law says now in the paper world that a notary is liable to any party damaged by the notary's negligence or official misconduct. So no, there's really no difference between liability in the paper world versus the remote notarization world. And states have addressed this liability from a consumer protection perspective in a couple of ways. Several states have actually required a higher bond for notaries who perform remote notarizations. And one state even has required a higher bond, as well as an additional errors and omissions insurance policy if you're going to be performing remote notarizations. A notary can protect themselves against liability through a number of ways with remote notarization. First, the audiovisual recording of the remote notarization can corroborate that the notary used reasonable care in performing the notarial act. If there are changes to the electronic document and the notary is alleged to have tampered with that document, the tamper-evident technology that's used in a remote notarization can produce a very lengthy audit trail of all the actions on that document and disprove any allegation that the notary has tampered with it. And then, like in the paper world, a notary can purchase optional errors and omissions insurance from any insurance agent to protect them from financial liability.
Thanks so much, Doug and Craig and Bill. Before we let you go, we are going to launch a few more poll questions. And if the panel has any thoughts and comments, once we get the answers, would love to hear from you. So first, what facet of RON are you most excited about? Check any that apply. Improving business operations and processes, improving access and the quality of notarization, reducing environmental waste through paper reduction, improved security and privacy, or other. Great. So it looks like the winner is improving business operations and processes, which I know the panel spoke a lot about, as well as improved security and privacy. Any thoughts on this from the panel?
Well, I think that, the audience is reflecting some of the things we've already said, that for notaries, remote notarization saves them time. It saves them time and travel. It can save them hard costs in paper, in printing out papers for refinance transactions. And also the security of remote notarization is a great plus for notaries.
Yeah, I'll probably follow on from what Bill was saying. Is what also strikes me is that I actually think that the improving business operations and security and privacy actually are almost saying similar things. And what I mean by that is, as we've been advising and engaging with governments around the country on this, the takeaway is that the typical traditional process for notarization is one where you don't have a lot of visibility into the step-by-step of what each individual notary does. The hope is that the training that has happened in advance, the professionalism of the person, will ensure that the steps taken are consistent. What I think remote online notary actually helps with is that improving of the business process, that you know that a notary now can actually perform the exact same steps in the exact same way, and also have it documented in further detail to help empower the notary as well as the customer who is actually needing the notarization done, to have that assurance that there's a consistent end-to-end approach to all of this. I mean, Bill, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the remote notarization is a very transparent process. We know exactly what everybody did in this. And so that is great for the public because it makes the notary accountable. And for the notary, it makes them be on their game, make sure that they're compliant with all facts of state law.
Great, thanks.
And I think from my perspective, one of the things that's we really don't talk about is that there's in the paper-based world right now, there is some notarial fraud that goes on, and there's some frustrations with prosecuting bad actor notaries, et cetera. I think some of those concerns will be tightened up through this process, where you have more of a real-time accounting, and the ability for the paper trail, as Bill's alluding to, I think should really help as well.
That's a great point, Craig. And one other thing that just kind of came to mind as we were just talking is I think often people are concerned that by doing remote online notarization, you only have a window into the world through the video link that restricts you really being able to see what's really going on in the dynamics. And the thing that has struck me is that when you start digging into that, whether it's a Zoom session or specifically like a document notary session and the like, is first, of course, you can ask someone to pan the room in order to actually see what's going on. Second, unlike a personal notarization, you actually record the session. So you can actually detect potentially further duress or other types of mannerisms that you wouldn't otherwise be able to document. And then third, I think there is a presumption that being there physically, you're able to read the air much better. When someone can be in another room or something can happen before the session actually occurred, that you're never going to be able to detect whether you're in person or it's remote online notary. So I do think there's plus and minuses to each of them, but as we dig into remote online notary and the ability to videotape the actual session as well as to record it, to actually have a record for later evidence, should there ever be a dispute, it actually is a better and a more solid process than the traditional physical approach.
Well, and I also just real quickly to tag on to the end of that, I think a lot has been made about the thumbprint requirement in California as being this foolproof anti-fraud device. And I think it does help. I mean, I think that using the paper notarial journal under existing law, and you have to provide a thumbprint for some documents, but not all, does create a paper trail of sorts for prosecution later, and also a disincentive if someone knows that their thumbprint will reside in the journal. But I think all the audio-visual information that will be gathered and the ability to have that recorded document would trump any kind of thumbprint requirements as being a disincentive. If I know I'm going to be recorded as a notary or signing a document, as a signatory, I'm going to think twice about it. I mean, I think that the thumbprint, I'll think once about that. But if I'm going to have a videotape of me signing the document, I'm going to be pretty hesitant if I know there's going to be that evidence out there.
Yeah, that's a great point, Craig. And then I think Andy also mentioned the other element, which is that most of the legislation is technology agnostic. So as the identity proofing type of technologies improve over time, we can actually improve the remote online notary process. And so today, as a snapshot, it's quite good already from the standpoint of disincentivizing people, documenting the evidentiary process. But as these identity technologies improve, whether it is biometric type of data, it'll only get better over time.
Great, thanks. So we have another poll question for the audience. What areas would you like to gain familiarity with to become more familiar with Ron? Check which of the below, if any, would prevent you from using Ron. Well, that's good news. 40% say that they are comfortable with Ron. That is great news. I see there's still a little bit of work to do on concerns with fraud and coercion. But I think, again, as the panel has well articulated, the technology certainly seeking to address those issues. So thank you, everyone, for participating in that particular question. Panel, anything that you'd like to further elaborate? I know we've talked a lot about these issues already, but welcome any thoughts.
I might just say very quickly about the coercion concern. Doug mentioned, the notary can pan the room with the camera. I remember back in 2011 when I went to oppose the remote notarization bill in Virginia in 2010. We told the committee, look, you won't know who's off camera. They could be holding a gun and nobody would know it. And that was enough to kill the bill that year. When I came back the next year and they enacted it, they came back and they said, well, with a regular paper notarization, the notary has a limited field of vision too. You don't know who's going to be outside of the room holding a gun. So in either case, the notary has a very limited window during which to qualify the signer for a notarial act, and they need to use their best judgment then.
Yeah, and Bill, on that point, I think looking at it even from a global perspective, and this topic is not unique to remote online notary or even the US for that matter. I mean, this is electronic witnessing and this is others. And what we are seeing is this comfort level coming into play that as people are starting to question what really is unique about the physical approach to things versus the digital, realizing that it's really just a familiarity rather than that it actually is, quote, better. And so we're seeing, for example, even like in Australia, that they're actually removing a lot of the requirements and being very comfortable with audiovisual for a lot of different types of transactions. And we're seeing in other areas of the world as well. So the good news is that I think a lot of things that we're talking about are very timely and are also heading in the direction that we're seeing around the world with regard to embracing digital technologies really to improve the situation and an appreciation that the physical approach is not necessarily always the high watermark of everything.
So terrific job to Andy for the presentation, to Doug and Bill and Craig for their panelist presentations. I know we wanted to put a resources page up. Doug, did you want to make a comment on this quickly?
Oh yeah, sure. So, part of DocuSign's trust brand is that we're always looking to really educate in the subject matter areas that obviously we're involved in, whether it's generally in digital transformation, specifically around electronic signature, remote online notarization, and other types of technologies. And so what we've tried doing in the spirit of what we have actually done with regard to electronic signature, where we have really, I think the number one popular kind of electronic signature legality guide, as we call it, we've just launched a similar one for remote online notary for all the states that have initiated legislation and are rolling it out, and that we also have white papers that we've actually pushed as well that help with things that you've heard today, such as interstate commerce and the full faith and credit clause, electronic notary generally, and the like. And of course, we partner with obviously the CLTA as well as NNA on a lot of this as well, and we'll continue to going forward. So we would just encourage you to just remain engaged. Let us know how we can help and how we can help lean in on all of this. And really appreciate everyone's time and engagement on all of this.